Well, welcome and thank you for watching. This is the London System versus Azeez 1100 Game 1. Our journey began with the chess.com beginner bots at Jimmy 600. We are now in the midst of the intermediate bots with chess.com at Azeez 1100 and making our way through taking the London system and applying it to every game, learning more about the London structure, the strategy, the lines of attack, and the tactics that can be utilized. So let's begin. d4, c6, bishop f4, and e6. Now, one of the things that I noticed in this is Azeez immediately opens these dark square diagonals for both the queen and the bishop. Again, it's just something to make note of. Again, if the queen does come out here or the bishop to either one of these, we know how to block with c3 or the b knight to d2. So really nothing to worry about at this point, just something to note. We can continue with e3, knight e7. Now, one of the things that concerned me about this move of the knight to e7 was the second move. And these are the squares where the knight can move. And it was these two squares at d5 and g6 that concerned me the most, because once the knight got there, it would be targeting my bishop. So I decided at this point to make that strategy move that we've talked about in the past of h3, giving the dark square bishop here a route of escape if we should need it. And sure enough, the knight moves to g6, putting our bishop under pressure. And so we're going to move back to the g3 square. Let me explain exactly why. First of all, we can protect the weak king's f2 pawn here. And the other is if the knight moves, it's going to land on a dark square, and I wanted to be able to cover that square should the knight move. I've done that by moving the dark square bishop to g3. And so we continue, knight a6, c3, queen f6. And sure enough, the queen comes out, and now we can see it would be targeting it, possibly this f2 square here. We are now covered with the bishop, so that was a good decision. Knight f3, we can move the knight up to kind of add another layer of protection from the queen and any future assaults that might come. Bishop e7, bishop d3, and then the knight goes back to b8. So now we kind of have the majority of our setup. There's just one move to make still, and that is the b knight to d2. And then Azeez responds by castling. So our setup is complete at this point, and now we need to look for a way in which to transition from the opening and setting up the opening structure to now beginning the middle game. And as we look at some of these variables, we can notice once again, we can advance our pawns forward. We also have this h square pawn to advance forward as well. And the only real movement for minor piece that I saw in this was taking the knight at b2 and moving it to e4, putting some pressure on the queen. So that's what I elected to do. Azeez responds very poorly, in fact, with a move of the knight back to a6, leaving the queen hanging. So it's an easy take and take. And now, once again, we need to, after a flurry of activity, reassess where we at, what can we do? And at this point, nothing really grabbed my attention other than taking this h pawn and beginning to advance it down the h file. So that's what I began doing. Azeez responds with h6. Probably would have been better for Azeez to come on up to h5 in that opening move, but nonetheless we can move one more, put the knight under pressure with this pawn, and Azeez responds with f5. Again, he's hanging another piece. Let's go ahead and take this knight. Azeez responds by taking at g6. So I want you to notice that there is a pawn that is not guarded, and that is this pawn here at h6. We can easily take our rook and capture that, and probably the best choice for Azeez now is try and protect this pawn at some point. He does not. He advances the d pawn to d6. Let's just go ahead and take this pawn at g6, check. And now the king moves to h8. So as I looked at the board at this point in the game, the one move that got my attention was the possibility of taking our queen along this light square diagonal and bringing it to h5, and that would cause checkmate. But how to go about that took me a little bit to work out. So my first move was to bring the bishop to h4 and challenge this dark square bishop here. Azeez responds by moving back to d8. So I thought, well, if I just go ahead and take, we'll draw the rook away from the king. So I made that move, capture, capture. And now I just need to get this knight at f3 out of the way so that I can advance my queen. And so I move to g5, and now my queen has the light square diagonal to come down. Azeez responds with the rook coming to d7, probably going to at least come over here to h7 to block. So we'll move our queen into position, check. The rook blocks, but now being protected by this knight, we can just move the queen on in and checkmate. So let me just make note of a couple of things that I have in prior games, and that is when you start with a solid structure like the London, getting it set up, when you understand how to transition from the opening to the middle game, understanding the lines of attack, understanding the key squares where we might place our pieces in order to move forward in the attack upon our opponent. When we do those things, good things happen. They always happen. It just seems like some of these opportunities open up, but it comes from having a solid structure and understanding the lines of attack. So I hope you enjoyed this game. We're going to move on to the London versus Azeez 1100 Game 2. Thank you again for watching. Look forward to seeing you in the next game.